In December of 1985, the Blackwood family vanished from the St. Jude's Head Lighthouse. Arthur, the keeper, his wife Eleanor, and their young daughter Lily disappeared into the fury of a winter storm. For 40 years, their story was a ghost story, a haunting local legend whispered by sailors and townspeople alike. The official report said they were swept away by a rogue wave, a tragic accident swallowed by the merciless Atlantic. The case file gathered dust, a cold, forgotten monument to a family lost to the sea. But the truth was far more terrifying, and it was not in the ocean. It was sealed in stone, waiting in the silent darkness beneath their feet. 40 years later, a routine structural inspection would drill into the heart of that mystery, making a chilling discovery that revealed the horrifying truth of what happened inside the lighthouse during that final desperate storm. What they found would change everything, rewriting a local legend into a tale of heartbreaking love and tragic miscalculation. Arthur Blackwood was a man carved from the same granite as the coast he watched over. At 45, his face was a roadmap of sea salt and wind, his eyes the color of a calm gray ocean. He had come to St. Jude's Head after a career in the Navy, seeking a quiet harbor from a world that had become too loud. He was a man of routine and solitude, yet his love for his family was a fierce, protective fire that burned brighter than the lighthouse lamp itself. His world revolved around two people, his wife, Eleanor, and their 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Eleanor was his opposite, a splash of vibrant color against his stoic gray. A painter from the city, she had followed him to this remote rock, bringing with her crates of books, canvases, and an unshakable belief that any place could be a home if it was filled with love. In letters to her sister, she wrote of the profound loneliness and the howling grief of the wind, but always ended by describing the joy of watching Lily grow up in her own private kingdom. She painted the changing moods of the sea, the dance of light on the water, and the quiet, powerful silhouette of her husband against the sky. Her art was a testament to the life she had built in this isolated place, a life of profound beauty and stark simplicity. Their daughter, Lily, knew no other world. The lighthouse was her castle, the spiral staircase her royal passage. The thunder of the waves was her lullaby. She was a child of the sea, with pockets full of sea glass and a wild imagination that turned gulls into messengers and fog banks into advancing armies of ghosts. Arthur taught her the constellations, naming each star as if he were introducing a personal friend. Eleanor taught her to mix colors, to capture the impossible blue of the deep ocean on paper. Their life was a tightly woven tapestry of small, precious moments. Game nights during howling gales with the roar of the storm a distant drumbeat, reading stories aloud in the warm glow of the lantern room. Arthur's core ambition was simple: to keep that light burning, both in the tower and in his family's eyes. He wanted to provide a sanctuary, a safe place shielded from the chaos of the outside world. He believed St. Jude's Head was the strongest place on earth, an unbreachable fortress against any storm. It was this conviction, this deep love and fierce desire to protect, that held the seeds of the coming tragedy. The day began like any other, under a sky the color of lead. A storm was coming. The weather radio crackled with warnings of a nor'easter, a monster churning up the coast, promising hurricane-force winds and waves that could swallow ships whole. Captain Joe, the grizzled skipper of the weekly supply boat, made his drop-off early. He noted that Arthur seemed different. The keeper's usual quiet confidence was replaced by a taut, nervous energy. "She's going to be a big one, Arthur," Joe had said, securing the last of the crates. Arthur had only nodded, his gaze fixed on the churning horizon. "The old stones are groaning," he'd muttered almost to himself. "Something feels different this time." Inside the tower, Eleanor was writing her weekly letter to her sister, Sarah. Her elegant script filled the page with a sense of foreboding she tried to disguise with cheer. She wrote of Lily's latest drawing, a dark, scribbled picture of the lighthouse with what looked like a monster hiding in its foundation. She mentioned Arthur's growing obsession with a damp patch near the base of the spiral staircase, how he'd spent the morning tapping at the stones, listening for something only he could hear. "He says the tower is settling," she wrote. "He has this look in his eye I haven't seen before. He says we're safer here than anywhere, that the tower has stood for 100 years and will stand for 100 more. I pray he's right." The decision not to evacuate was Arthur's alone. The Coast Guard had offered passage on the supply boat, a standard precaution for a storm of this magnitude. But Arthur refused. He was the keeper. Leaving his post during a storm was unthinkable. It was a matter of pride, of duty. It was a fatal mistake. As the afternoon light faded, the storm hit. The sky and sea merged into a single roaring vortex of black water and screaming wind. The waves were titanic, exploding against the rock with the force of cannonballs. The entire tower shuddered with each impact. Arthur's last radio transmission to the mainland was a burst of static-choked panic. St. Jude's Head, taking on water, lower levels, main door. Then the line went dead. Hours later, a fishing boat miles away reported the unthinkable. The light at St. Jude's Head, the unwavering star that had guided sailors for a century, had gone dark. The world was eerily silent the next morning. The storm had broken, leaving behind a bruised sky and a deceptively calm sea. But on the horizon, the silhouette of the St. Jude's Head Lighthouse stood dark and lifeless. The silence on the radio was absolute. The Coast Guard dispatched the cutter, vigilant to investigate. The approach was tense. The massive stone tower, usually a symbol of safety, now seemed like a tombstone. There was no sign of life, no figure waving from the gallery, no smoke from the chimney. The crew hailed the lighthouse, their calls swallowed by the vast emptiness. They received no reply. A small team motored to the base of the rock. They found the heavy oak door to the lighthouse not just closed but locked from the inside. A cold knot of dread tightened in the petty officer's stomach. This was wrong. All wrong. After several minutes of fruitless banging, they made the decision to force the door. The wood splintered, and the lock gave way with a groan. They stepped inside, into a scene of chilling normalcy. The air was cold and still. In the small living area, a half-eaten meal of stew and bread sat on the table, plates set for 3. A book lay open on a chair, its page held by a pair of reading glasses. Lily's small red raincoat was hanging on its peg by the door. In the hearth, a fire had long since burned down to ash. It looked as if the family had simply vanished mid-meal. They searched the tower, room by room. The beds were made, the clothes were in their drawers, but there was no one. The tower was empty. Back on the ground floor, one of the younger seamen noticed something out of place. Near the base of the massive cast-iron spiral staircase, a small pile of tools lay on the stone floor. A hammer, a chisel, a trowel thick with fresh mortar. Beside them was a fine dusting of granite powder, as if someone had been working on the wall itself. The lead officer picked up the keeper's logbook from its desk. He flipped to the last entry, dated the previous day. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. It read, "The sea calls for a toll, the foundations tremble. I will not let it take them." Confusion gave way to a rising tide of fear. The locked door meant they couldn't have gone outside. The half-eaten meal suggested a sudden interruption, and the tools by the staircase felt like a cryptic clue to a puzzle no one could comprehend. They weren't just missing. It was as if the lighthouse itself had swallowed them. The discovery launched one of the largest search and rescue operations the Maine coast had ever seen. The official theory was simple and brutal. A rogue wave had somehow breached the lower entrance, sweeping the family out to sea. It was the only explanation that seemed to make sense, despite the troubling inconsistencies. For days, the air buzzed with the sound of helicopter rotors, and the sea was crisscrossed by the wakes of Coast Guard cutters. Divers, battling treacherous currents that swirled around the base of the rock, descended into the frigid, murky water. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no debris. It was as if the Atlantic had erased the Blackwood family completely. The search was immediately plagued by misfortune. Just 2 days in, another squall rolled in, grounding all air support and making the seas impassable. A search helicopter, caught in a violent downdraft, was nearly lost, forcing a harrowing emergency landing on the mainland that injured its pilot. The incident cast a pall over the entire operation, a grim reminder that the sea was still in control. The divers' reports were disheartening. The currents were a nightmare, a chaotic underwater blender that could carry a body for miles in any direction within hours. After a week of exhaustive searching, morale was low and hope was fading. The official narrative hardened into fact, championed by the man in charge of the investigation, Chief Petty Officer Miller. He was a man just months from retirement, a bureaucrat who saw the world in tidy, easily closed files. To him, the locked door was an anomaly, likely a result of the storm's pressure. The tools were just tools. He saw a straightforward tragedy and was impatient with any suggestion of a deeper mystery. His focus was on closing the case. This dismissive attitude met its fiercest opponent in Eleanor's sister, Sarah. She arrived from Boston, a whirlwind of grief and desperate energy. She clutched Eleanor's letters, presenting them to Miller as evidence of Arthur's growing paranoia and his obsession with the lighthouse's foundation. He was afraid of something inside the tower, not just the storm, she pleaded, her voice cracking. You have to search the structure itself, the walls, the floors. Something isn't right. Miller patronized her, his tone condescending. He saw a grieving woman lost in hysterics, unable to accept the simple, tragic truth. He dismissed her pleas as the product of emotional distress, patting her hand and assuring her they were doing everything they could. He refused to authorize what he called a destructive and pointless search of the historic structure. For him, the case was already solved. After 2 weeks with no leads and mounting costs, the official search for the Blackwood family was called off. They were declared lost at sea, victims of a terrible storm. For the rest of the world, the story was over. But for Sarah, the fight had just begun. The years that followed were cold and silent. The St. Jude's Head Lighthouse, once a symbol of guidance, became a monument to loss. The official file on the Blackwood family was stamped closed and relegated to a dusty archive shelf. The mystery, however, refused to die. It seeped into the local folklore, becoming a ghost story told to frighten children and unnerved sailors. The lighthouse was automated 2 years after the disappearance. No keeper was willing to take the post, to live with the ghosts of a family who had vanished from a locked room. The tower stood empty and silent, its powerful lamp now lit and extinguished by a distant machine. It became a grim landmark. On foggy nights, boat captains would swear they could see a faint flickering light in the keeper's quarters, or hear the phantom laughter of a child on the wind. The tower was no longer St. Jude's Head. It was the Blackwood Light, a place of sorrow and unanswered questions. For Eleanor's sister Sarah, the passage of time brought no peace. The cold years were a relentless campaign. She spent her savings on private investigators who found nothing. She wrote countless letters to the Coast Guard, to politicians, to newspapers, begging them to reopen the case. Each letter was a cry in the wilderness, met with polite form letter dismissals. Chief Miller's initial report had become gospel, and no one was willing to challenge it. Sarah grew old, the sharp edges of her grief worn down into a permanent, aching sorrow. She never remarried, never had children. Her life became a vigil for a family that the world had forgotten. The community on the mainland remembered the Blackwoods with a small brass plaque bolted to the town pier. It listed their names and the date they were lost to the sea. It was a period on a sentence that, for Sarah, still had no end. The story of their disappearance settled into a comfortable legend, a chilling tale of the ocean's power. The official story was accepted by all but one: the locked door, the tools, the mortar dust. These were the details that haunted Sarah's sleep, the loose threads that proved the official narrative was a lie. For 40 years she kept pulling at them, waiting for the day the whole story would finally unravel. For 4 decades, the lighthouse kept its secret. Then, in the spring of 2025, the gears of fate began to turn. The St. Jude's Head Lighthouse, now a designated National Historic Landmark, was suffering from the ravages of time and tide. The Maritime Heritage Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to preserving coastal history, secured a grant for a massive restoration project. The first step was a complete structural assessment to determine the stability of the 150-year-old tower. The job was assigned to Maria Flores, a brilliant and meticulous young structural engineer. She was fascinated by the history of the buildings she worked on, and she had read the tragic story of the Blackwood family. To her, the tower was not just stone and mortar. It was a place filled with unanswered questions. As part of her assessment, she used state-of-the-art ground-penetrating radar to scan the foundation and the rock it was built on. She wasn't looking for anything more than cracks or water damage. But the radar showed something else. It was an anomaly, a clear and undeniable void beneath the stone floor at the base of the spiral staircase. It was a rectangular chamber, roughly 10 feet by 8 feet, that appeared on no of the original blueprints from the 1880s. It was completely sealed. Her first report to her supervisor was met with skepticism. "It's probably an old cistern or a forgotten storage cellar," her boss said, glancing at the scans. "Don't worry about it." But Maria couldn't let it go. The location of the void was too precise. She pulled up the digitized cold case file for the Blackwood disappearance, her heart pounding as she read the initial report from 1985. The details leaped off the page: a pile of tools, fresh mortar, a fine dusting of granite powder. They were all found in the exact spot where the radar now showed a hidden room. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't a cistern. This was something else. She cross-referenced the file with old newspaper clippings about the case and found an interview with Eleanor's sister, Sarah, who had pleaded with investigators to search the foundation. They had refused. Maria realized she was standing on the precipice of a discovery that could solve a 40-year-old mystery. This was the turn, the unexpected catalyst. The silent stones of the lighthouse were finally about to speak. The call from Maria Flores sent a shockwave through the local state police barracks. The Blackwood case was legend, a ghost story most of the current officers had grown up with. It was immediately assigned to Detective Isabella Rossi, the head of the department's fledgling cold case unit. Rossi was tenacious, a quiet investigator who believed that truth, no matter how old, never truly expired. She devoured the original case file, her anger growing with every page. She saw the dismissive notes from Chief Miller, the ignored pleas from Sarah, the glaring clues, the locked door, the tools, that were swept aside in the rush to close the case. The existence of a hidden chamber was the key that unlocked everything. Within 24 hours, Rossi had assembled a small team, including a forensics unit and a medical examiner, and they were en route to St. Jude's Head. Maria Flores met them at the lighthouse, her face a mixture of excitement and dread. She pointed to the spot on the floor. "It's here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The air in the tower was heavy with anticipation. The team set up their equipment, the modern gleam of steel and plastic a stark contrast to the ancient, weathered stone. The plan was to be as non-invasive as possible. They used a diamond-tipped core drill to bore a small hole through the floor, and the layer of what they now knew was concrete and stone beneath it. The moment the drill bit broke through, a puff of stale, foul air hissed out. It was the smell of a place that had not breathed for a very, very long time. They fed a small fiber optic camera through the hole. On the monitor, a grainy black and white image appeared. It was dark, but they could make out shapes. The camera panned slowly. First a small boot, then the shape of a person, huddled against a wall, then another, and another, smaller one, held in the arms of the second. A collective gasp went through the room. They were there. They had been there all along. The excavation began in earnest. The team worked with the somber reverence of archaeologists unearthing a sacred tomb. They carefully cut away the section of the floor, revealing the crudely sealed stone slab beneath. It took 2 hours to pry it loose. When it was finally lifted away, the secret of the Blackwood family was revealed to the light. Inside the small, dark chamber were 3 bodies. They were remarkably preserved by the cool, airtight conditions, almost mummified. Arthur, Eleanor, and Lily. Arthur was sitting with his back against the wall, his arms wrapped protectively around Eleanor, whose head rested on his shoulder, and cradled in Eleanor's arms was Lily, her small form bundled in a thick wool blanket. It was a tableau of peaceful sleep, a horrifying, silent portrait of a family's final moments. The initial forensic analysis on site confirmed they had not been victims of violence. The cause of death appeared to be asphyxiation. They had run out of air. But the greatest question remained. Why? Why would they entomb themselves? The answer came from a place no one had ever thought to look. While the forensics team worked, Detective Rossi conducted her own search of the tower. She had a hunch that a man like Arthur Blackwood, a man of logs and letters, would not have met his end without writing it down. In the lantern room, behind a loose block of granite in the wall, she found it. A small, leather-bound journal. It was Arthur's personal log. The last few pages, written in a fading, hurried pencil script, told the whole story. He wrote of the storm's unimaginable fury, of a wave so powerful it had shattered the lower windows and buckled the main door, jamming it shut. Water was pouring in, rising fast. They were trapped. In a desperate last-ditch effort to save his family, he turned to an old lighthouse legend, a secret smuggler's cache hidden in the foundation. He had found it years ago. It was their only hope. He broke through the floor with his tools and moved a terrified Eleanor and Lily inside the small, dry chamber. His plan was to seal the entrance from the inside using the mortar he had on hand for repairs, just enough to keep the water out. He believed they could wait out the storm and then dig their way out once the water receded. It was a desperate gamble, and it was a fatal miscalculation. He had sealed the tomb too well, creating a perfectly airtight chamber. He thought they had a day's worth of air. They only had a few hours. The final entry, scrawled in a shaky, barely legible hand, was a testament to his love and his failure. The air is thin now, so hard to breathe. Eleanor and Lily are asleep. They look so peaceful. I told them we were safe. I have failed them. My loves, my lights, God forgive me. The news broke like a tidal wave. The discovery at the St. Jude's Head Lighthouse became an international story. The ghosts had been found, not in the sea, but in a tomb of their father's own making. The narrative shifted instantly from a haunting mystery to a devastating human tragedy. Detective Rossi held a press conference, her voice steady as she laid out the sequence of events, reading excerpts from Arthur Blackwood's final journal entries. She painted a picture not of a monster or a madman, but of a desperate father and husband, making a calculated and ultimately fatal choice to protect his family from the storm. He wasn't a villain. He was a hero, whose plan had gone horribly wrong. The why was finally answered. It was not malice or murder, but a perfect storm of circumstances. The sheer power of the ocean, a jammed door, and a father's misjudgment of time and air in a sealed space. But for Rossi, the explanation of what happened to the Blackwoods was only half the story. The other half was explaining why it had taken 40 years to find them. With Arthur's journal as irrefutable proof of their location inside the tower, Rossi publicly revisited the failures of the 1985 investigation. She detailed how Chief Petty Officer Miller had willfully ignored crucial evidence. He had dismissed the tools and mortar as insignificant. He had shut down Sarah's pleas to search the structure, labeling her as hysterical. His investigation was a case of confirmation bias. He decided it was an accident at sea and refused to entertain any other possibility. It was a catastrophic failure of due diligence, a clear case of bureaucratic indifference that had compounded the tragedy. The truth had been there all along, waiting just beneath the floorboards. But Miller's arrogance and haste had left it buried for 4 decades. The real conspiracy was not one of hidden malice, but of plain, simple incompetence and a lack of empathy. The full, heartbreaking story was now clear for the world to see. A loving family trapped by a storm, a father's desperate plan for salvation, a single fatal error, and a failed investigation that sealed their tomb and created a legend that would haunt the coast for generations. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Detective Rossi drove to a quiet nursing home in suburban Boston. She found Sarah, now 87 years old, sitting in a wheelchair by a window, her gaze distant. She was frail, but her eyes, the same color as her sister Eleanor's, were still sharp. Rossi sat beside her and gently told her everything. She explained what had happened, how Arthur had tried to save them, how they had died together, peacefully in the end. She told her they had been found. For a long moment, Sarah was silent, the news washing over her in waves. Then, for the first time in 40 years, she let go. A deep, shuddering sob shook her small frame, a release of decades of anger, frustration, and unending grief. But through the tears, there was also a profound, heartbreaking relief. "So he didn't hurt them," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. "He was trying to save them." Rossi nodded. He was. The greatest weight on Sarah's soul had been the fear that Arthur, in a fit of madness, had been responsible for their deaths. Knowing the truth, as terrible as it was a kind of solace. It recast Arthur not as a monster, but as the loving man she remembered. The most powerful moment came when Rossi handed her a protected copy of Arthur's journal. With trembling hands, Sarah read her brother-in-law's final words, his desperate prayer, and his declaration of love for his wife and child. The mystery that had defined her life was over. She finally had closure. A few weeks later, on a windswept cliff on the mainland overlooking the lighthouse, the Blackwood family was finally laid to rest. The small service was attended by the handful of townspeople who still remembered them, by Maria Flores, the engineer who found them, and by Detective Rossi. Sarah sat in the front row, holding a single white rose. As the final prayer was said, she looked out at the distant, silent tower of St. Jude's Head. The ghosts were at peace. The story of the Blackwood family left an indelible mark, becoming more than just a local legend. It evolved into a profound lesson on the nature of love, desperation, and the razor-thin line between salvation and tragedy. Arthur Blackwood's story was not a simple one. It was a complex portrait of a father's love, so powerful that it led him to create a sanctuary that became a tomb. It served as a chilling reminder that even the most heroic intentions can be undone by a single, simple miscalculation. The case also became a catalyst for change. The public exposure of the original investigation's failures was a source of deep embarrassment for state authorities. It highlighted the critical importance of listening to families and pursuing every lead, no matter how insignificant it may seem. In the years that followed, an unofficial Blackwood rule was adopted by regional cold case units, mandating a thorough structural review of any isolated or historic buildings connected to a disappearance. It was a legacy written in policy, ensuring that the mistake made in 1985 would not be repeated. The St. Jude's Head Lighthouse was eventually fully restored. It shines again, its light automated but constant. The foundation, however, was not sealed over. Instead, the Historical Society chose to preserve the small, hidden chamber. It is now visible behind a thick panel of reinforced glass, a quiet, somber memorial. A small bronze plaque tells the family's true story. The lighthouse is no longer a place of haunting, but a place of remembrance, a towering monument to a family's final, tragic embrace, and a father's desperate, all-consuming love. A father's desperate attempt to build a sanctuary from the storm became his family's tomb, a secret kept by stone and sea for 40 years. The truth was always there, waiting just below the surface for someone willing to look. If the story of the Blackwood family moved you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it, and subscribing for more true crime mysteries that were thought to be lost to time. We want to know what you think. Tell us in the comments below. Was Arthur Blackwood a tragic hero whose love knew no bounds, or was his pride in refusing to evacuate the ultimate cause of the tragedy? Let's discuss it in the comments.